Next question.
And maybe before you go on, I'd like to maybe take a comment on that, which maybe then Louie can obviously respond to, and you can. I think there's a few preliminaries we do need to clarify. So I'll just lay out what I think about them. One, when we talk about no, because we've been talking about that a lot, do we know who is the Pope or no? We have to understand what we mean by that. And then secondly, I wanted to say a little bit about the nature of authority that you were hinting at. So when it comes to no, and truth, there are really two different meanings of that. One, which say St. Thomas calls speculative knowledge or speculative truth, and practical. And I think in common parlance, we don't usually distinguish. We just say, I know, or that's true. But I think for our discussion, it'd be helpful to lay those out. And then also what levels of certainty we can have about those things. So briefly, speculative truth is how is the correspondence of your mind to reality.
Yes.
So I'm looking at this picture on my computer of Louie, and I say that's Louie Verrecchio, and my mind sees it as Louie Verrecchio, and I'm right because I think it's right. But if I look at him and say, that's Jane Doe, my mind's not corresponding. So it's the correspondence of our mind to reality. But practical truth is something different, and that, as St. Thomas defines, is the correspondence, right, of our judgment to what is good. So when the truth, should I do this, is a true thing. It's a true judgment if it corresponds to what is good. And so that's a little different. So I just want to give an example to help explain that. So maybe there's someone who thinks they're wrong about abortion. They think abortion is what happens in an abortion is just the prevention of a life coming into being. They're just speculatively wrong. That's just not corresponding to reality. But they then say, but it's still wrong. I don't want to do it. Abortion is still an evil thing. Well, they've made a correct practical judgment. Abortion is wrong, even though their speculative judgment is wrong. So it's possible to be wrong in your speculative knowledge, but correct in your practical knowledge, and vice versa, right? You could say, well, speculative abortion is the killing of a human being, but I think it's a good thing. I think that's a good thing to happen. You are correct in reality of what is happening, but you made a bad practical judgment. The reason I say that is there are some things in which we may not know the correct speculative judgment, but we can make a correct practical judgment. And so from the history of the church, for example, we know in the earliest centuries, Christians judged the Blessed Sacrament to be Christ, and they treated the Blessed Sacrament, they acted in accordance with good. We are going to treat it this way, although they didn't perhaps speculatively know what was transubstantiation. So exactly what does that mean? How does that happen? That knowledge wasn't there yet, but they still had a correct practical judgment. Now, the last point I want to make about that is again, knowledge. When we talk about knowledge, we talk about certainty. And there are certain things we can know, both practically and speculatively, with complete certainty. And they are what God has directly revealed. So we know God is a Trinity, and it's not possible to doubt that. We know that something cannot be true and untrue in the same time, in the same sense. And there's no way to doubt that statement. It is just known without doubt. There are other things that we say we know, and we're not necessarily doubting them. We know them with a moral certainty, but it is possible that if we got more information, we could realize our correspondence of our mind was not actually perfect to reality. So we say we know them, but we don't know them with the same certainty of faith that excludes doubt as even a possibility. And then there are things we can know that we maybe say, well, and we often use the word opinion, not in the modern sense of like, well, that's what I believe, but based on the best information, this is true, but I recognize I may learn more, and that preliminary judgment of what's true may be incorrect, and I will revise my judgment. Now, this is unique to human nature because we are not omniscient. So God knows everything without doubt and perfect, everything up to the hair of our head, but we are not God. Even if we have the divine life in us, we share in his divine life through grace. we don't know the same way he knows. So we always have to, I think, keep that in mind when we're going to have these and having these conversations and putting these out, that first of all, we may be able to make speculative judgments about what's happening in the church or what things are that are sort of the best we can know now, but realize we could be wrong. And I think Louie actually alluded to this a little bit earlier in his prior comment about, well, how will the church get out of this crisis? And that's often how the church has grown in the not modern sense in her understanding, right? That the church has not resolved matters of speculative truth just willy-nilly. Like, well, hey, we want to know if this is absolutely true or not. She's done it when the need arose, and then she resolved that. And we go throughout history many times where there is some uncertainty, where maybe we know what we should do, we know the practical result, we know generally the truth, but an aspect of it, or is this possible, or could this happen in the church? We can have conversations, saints did, about it, but we don't actually know the answer until the need comes and the church clarifies it definitively. Then as to authority, my second point, and I'll turn it over quickly, is I think, Father, I want to follow up what you say is very important, that authority of any human agent, even one who has divine gifts, is not directly the authority of God. So God can never misuse his authority. It's not compatible with his nature. But any human being can misuse their authority in summary in two ways. One, by exceeding it. So even though the Pope is the supreme authority on earth, there is no one can judge the Pope, again, as the church has said. And again, there's a little qualification on that statement that was in Gratian, but does disappear in 1917. But putting that aside, there's no see can judge the Holy See. But supreme doesn't necessarily mean there are things not outside his authority. It's his supreme authority on earth. And as you said, Father, the Pope is the vicar of Christ, not Christ, right? And so the Pope, for example, cannot create a sacrament, because that, even though he has supreme authority, is outside the scope of his authority. But secondly, all authorities can misuse their authority, not consistent with its end. So authority exists for the common good. And that's when we talk about a legitimate and illegitimate exercise of authority. An authority, even if it's within your scope, that is done not for the common good, is not a proper exercise of that authority. It's beyond the scope in a different sense, not because that subject matter's off, but you didn't use it in a certain way. And so again, I think it may be helpful. I would just want to lay those few points out here, because I think they may be helpful for where I see the conversation going. But I'll leave it to both of you then maybe to respond to what I've said.
Okay, if I may, Brian, the most compelling thing that I took away from your breakdown of knowledge and clarifying between speculative and practical is the degree to which practical knowledge so often points to speculative knowledge that hasn't quite yet been defined. And you gave the example of the faithful in their treatment of the Blessed Sacrament before they even had the knowledge of the doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Most Holy Eucharist. And I think we see something like that taking place today with regard to the papacy, and looking at Francis in particular. As I had said previously, I don't think there's anybody watching this podcast today, I doubt that there is, who genuinely treats Francis as father, teacher, and guide in the matters of faith. They don't treat him as the Pope. Now, granted, Holy Mother Church hasn't looked back on this mess that we're living through and declared definitively that man was an anti-pope. But the sensus Catholicus that's in the faithful today, those who sincerely want to be Catholic, they realize they can't follow this man. They can't treat him like the Pope because they'll lose their faith. Not a single parent listening to this today, in all likelihood, who would encourage their children to look to this man as father, teacher, and guide on the way of salvation. So I think the practical knowledge about, Francis and his claims to the papacy is playing out before our eyes. I would also point out a couple of things that the church taught about the Pope that gives you a sense for the idea that even though anyone that exercises human authority can exceed those bounds, I would argue that the supernatural gifts imparted to the Roman pontiffs is such that it acts like a brake on that in a sense. which is why we've never seen in 2,000 years a pope attempting to institute things like an eighth sacrament. We don't see those sorts of things. Why? Because it's our inclination as human beings to exceed our authority and to abuse it. But we've never really seen anything like what we've seen since the days of council. And why is that? Is it because these guys are singularly flawed? Or is it because they really don't have that supernatural gift that the popes have? In any case, I think this quote from Leo XIII speaks about what's going on today. He says that it gives proof of a submission to the Pope, which is far from sincere, to set up some kind of opposition between one pontiff and another. Those who, faced with two different directives, reject the present one to hold to the past. Those persons are not in proof of obedience to the authority, which has the right and duty to guide them. This brings to my mind Amoris Laetitia. One of the first reactions to it was people saying, well, wait a minute, this can't be so, because look at what John Paul II taught. Look at what Benedict taught. Look at what was taught before. I'm going to stick with what Pope Pius XII taught us. I'm not going to go with what Pope Francis is teaching us. And this is an example, I think, of that practical knowledge that is playing out before our eyes, even though Holy Mother Church hasn't definitively identified Francis as an anti-pope. People know that he can't be followed safely, and the Pope can be followed safely in matters of faith and morals. That's part of the makeup of the church and the purpose of the papacy.
Excellent points. Yes, I would just add that Brian's speculative knowledge and practical knowledge is absolutely vital. Unfortunately, after Vatican II, many good things were jettisoned, right? Like Thomism and scholastic thought. I think we need that in modern theology because if our perception of reality is not according to reality, objective reality, it's what we think it is. That's why we're in the mess we're in. Talk about gender ideology. I think I'm a man today. Tomorrow I'm a woman. I mean, this is everyday thing, and it's just absolutely ludicrous. It's madness on a massive scale. That's in the social order, but in the church and the ecclesial order, it's the same thing in theology. What the church has always taught, we can change that now, and we could even say that actually it's continuity. Well, no, it's not continuity. I mean, that you're trying to change our perception of reality when we're making a total break from what the church has always taught, and not just the preconciliar church, not just the preconciliar popes, but even Benedict XVI or John Paul II. Francis is going against what his immediate predecessors have said on certain issues. So, but there's continuity. So, no, there isn't. So there's something wrong with our capacity for recognizing true reality. And that's really a massive problem that I don't know how we're going to get out of this. And then Louis was saying, applying to who's the Pope, and the Pope can be safely followed as we should be, submissive, and he's the rule of faith. Again, if he is indeed the rule of faith, it has to apply to him. He has to be the first one to submit to Christ and what he receives as apostolic tradition. I think it was Bishop Strickland over there. He's in Texas, I think. He said yes. He cannot follow Francis because he accuses him, rather extraordinary. He has a plan to undermine the sacred deposit of faith. That's extraordinary. Well, that can't be, and yet it is. So we have a paradox here. How do we get out of this? Can a pope actually do that? Have a systematic assault on the deposit of faith? It's a very sticky problem.
So maybe I know we do have some other questions, but I think this conversation is building. So maybe let me respond to a couple things that particularly you and Louis said, and I think one of them is what do we know about the nature of the papacy and sort of the things Louis said, for example, that what can the Pope, what is it impossible for him to do? And again, in the history of the church, we know more in a properly understood sense than the first century. In a certain sense, we don't, right? Because we know the deposit of faith, but the depth of our understanding and the details is what grows. And again, that's what's distinguished from the era of modernism, where they think, well, we just pick up new stuff. But it is true, the depth of our understanding of the truths has grown, and that's how the church does grow in knowledge of dogma, properly understood. But with that, what it means is what do we know? There are different levels, again, of our knowledge of what the church has taught. And as now from Vatican I, the church has clearly, with great detail, defined the exercise of the extraordinary magisterium. So the gift, to use the term Louis uses, the gift of infallibility that was promised to Peter and successors. It's not that nobody before Vatican I knew about infallibility of the Pope. They understood it, but they didn't understand more precisely what it was, how it worked. And then Vatican I has now laid that down. So we now know when the Pope exercises that and what it means. No Pope would ever exercise the extraordinary magisterium and teach something that is erroneous on faith or morals. We also know the church has told us, and Vatican I has explained, that there's the ordinary magisterium, which also has an infallibility. Now, the difference with those is Vatican I has defined it in a certain sense, and again, it's nothing new. It goes back to St. Vincent of Lerins, what the church has always, everywhere, and by everyone believed. So we know what the ordinary magisterium is. But Vatican I was more focused on the details of the extraordinary magisterium. We don't know with the same level of certainty as the Proclamation of Vatican I on extraordinary magisterium is, first of all, this concept of authentic magisterium, which is a rather new term in the history of the church. So when a pope or a bishop who is a pope or bishop is actually teaching, what does it mean to say they have an authentic magisterium? And I know it's a term that those who adhere to the conciliar propositions use a lot, but it's very undefined, right? It may be part of the church's teaching, that as a concept, it may not, but it is not defined with the same certainty as extraordinary magisterium. But even related to that, we know when something has been taught always and everywhere and by everyone, it can't be wrong. So that our Lord is truly present in the Blessed Sacrament, even though there's not been a papal declaration like the Assumption, let's say, it is always and everywhere and believed that murder is properly defined, is always wrong. We don't have an extraordinary definition, but we know. We know that, but what we don't know is the relationship between in time individual acts. That we know there are people who have said things in the history of the church, people in authority, that are not part of that ordinary magisterium, that is infallible. Just to give an example, again, a well-known example, John the 22nd spoke and taught in sermons something that is not consistent with the ordinary magisterium. He did not proclaim it. He was just teaching about the particular judgment versus the general judgment. That act, the times he was speaking, we know were not extraordinary magisterium and don't fit in the ordinary magisterium. But how in time you look at individual instances and how that's something that the church hasn't yet had the opportunity. My own personal opinion is this crisis is probably something that will facilitate that. It will cause the church at some point to give us a clearer explanation of that. But that's what we don't know. And I think that when we move from extraordinary magisterium ex cathedra, which we now have definitions for, which no post-conciliar pope has claimed to do, even when it appeared John Paul II might have been heading in that direction on the declaration of invalidity of ordaining women, he actually said, no, I didn't do that. So none of them have ever invoked using that. And therefore, I think all of their acts fall short of that. And the one thing we know for certain is no pope will say, I am speaking ex cathedra, defining faith and morals in a way that is contrary to the faith. And I would agree, if one did that and we know it, he says, I'm defining the Assumption never happened, that is one way we would know that he can't be the pope, because that's, we know with certainty, because the doctrine of the Assumption was declared definitively by Pope Pius XII. But beyond that level, we have certain principles we know, but we don't know with the same certainty all of the details. And that's where I do one other caveat, and I will wrap up soon, that when we read a lot of statements of theologians, of great saints, about, or even Pope Pius XII, who I good, excellent pope, about the nature of the papacy and things we should do, and practical knowledge about we should follow the Pope, we always have to be careful because they are not giving us firm definitions, and they are speaking about a way to treat the Pope and act toward the way to live out that subjection to the Pope in certain circumstances. And therefore, if they were to live in our time, they might say, well, I was speaking to something that was not so extraordinary as your time, and I wasn't saying it as an absolute, as we would say now, for example, about exercise of extraordinary magisterium. And then the last point I would just say, when we get to the gifts, we know that that gift of infallibility is given. We know what it means. I also agree with Louis, other gifts have been given to the Pope. But we also know that with any gift, the presence of a gift, even a supernatural gift, doesn't mean that the person is forced to use the gift. So we always have to be careful with that. When we say the Pope has certain supernatural gifts, we in our free will can refuse to use those gifts. And again, one example I'll give, the post-conciliar popes have refused to use their extraordinary majesty, the exercise the extraordinary magisterium, speaking ex cathedra. They haven't done it. And now again, you get into why I think they haven't, but they haven't. They've refused to use that gift. We on our level, I'll bring it down to our level, we all have the infused gifts from baptism and from confirmation. They're different from, I agree, the gifts the Pope will have, but of knowledge, of wisdom. But the fact that we have those gifts, we may reject them, right? The Holy Ghost might use the gift of wisdom to try to help us, and we just say, well, I'm not going to use that. I'm going to do this. I'm going on my own. I'm not going to take that. And so we always have to be careful. Even if the Pope has a gift, that doesn't mean that God will force him to make use of that gift.
Very good. Okay, so I think when we're talking about submission to the Roman Pontiff,
yes,
we do well to focus more on our obligation as opposed to whether or not the Pope is actually using the gifts that have been divinely conferred upon him. So going back to something that Leo XIII said, he said it's an absolute necessity for the simple faithful to submit to the Roman Pontiff. This idea of the simple faithful, one of the things that's out of step with the notion that many of the faithful are very simple. And the fact that something you said earlier, Brian, one's not obligated to be a theologian, to be a faithful Catholic. But we've gotten to a point now where we're trying to parse things and figure out when it's okay to follow the Pope. Leo XIII said, in defining the limits of obedience owed to the pastors of souls, but most of all to the authority of the Roman Pontiff, it must not be supposed that it's only to be yielded in relation to dogmas, of which the obstinate denial cannot be disjoined from the crime of heresy. So it's not enough just to follow the dogmas. And I would say that when it comes to following the Pope as the rule of faith, it's not the case that the Church is telling us, or has ever even hinted, that we're to follow the Pope as the rule of faith if he behaves as the rule of faith. No, we're told to follow the Pope because he is the rule of faith. And if you see a man who's not the rule of faith, that's a pretty strong indication that he's not. And you see this playing out once again in the practical knowledge that people are applying every day to the person of Francis. I know many priests, conservative Novus Ordo priests, who won't even mention the man's name. They won't bring up anything that he's ever said or done in a sermon. Why? Because they don't see him as the rule of faith, as one that can be safely followed. But the Pope can. And the Church has always encouraged her faithful, especially the simple ones, to follow the Holy Father as the rule of faith, because he's your father, he's your teacher, he's your guide. In the current situation and the way in which most quote unquote traditional Catholics look at the men that they consider to be the Pope, the simple Catholic has no chance. He has no chance. The best that he can do is, follow a blog that's written by somebody with a degree in sacred theology and hope to God that that guy's got it right.
I was going to say the curious thing, though, with the conciliar era and the post-conciliar era is that it's true that ex cathedra has not been invoked, though John Paul II's Ordinatio Sacerdotalis from 1994 practically is. I think it's what in traditional theological terms is fide proxima. So it's practically a dogmatic definition, even if it's not technically. ex cathedra. But the problem with Vatican II and onward is, because I recall that Paul VI, in his communications with Archbishop Lefebvre, said that Vatican II, being a pastoral council, was more important than the First Council of Nicaea. That's quite honestly an absurd claim on its face. How can that council be more important than the First Council of Nicaea, which, came out against the terrible Arian crisis? Vatican II doesn't define anything. Whatever it says when it mentions the Trinity, well, we already knew that. When it mentions some other basic common knowledge of the faith, we already accept it. And another thing that goes on with the Vatican II is that it's dogmatized as if it's the council of the church. It's something we all pick up. It's a problem. It's the council. Like there's no council before it. It's the go for all. It's everything. And Francis uses the council to teach whatever he thinks is conciliar teaching. That's debatable whether the council really gives him that authority to do that, but he invokes it. So it's really a mess. It's really a mess where a mere pastoral council is dogmatized as a super dogma, which even Benedict XVI denounced in his day.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I think that's a good. I think we can all agree it's a mess. I'd say yes, but I'd like to follow a little bit what Louie said, and I do want to clarify because Louie's right. I'm not saying, or nor do I believe that it's like, well, you just have to look at the infallible pronouncements, and if the Pope does that, you follow it. Everything else you can ignore. I'm not saying that at all, and I agree with Louie that what we are required to do is greater than that. It's not that minimalist. What it really means is, and that's going to go back to when I talked about authority. It's really the submission of the will. We have to say, in the matter of governance, I'm going to take that first before we get to dogma. In the matter of governance, I am going to submit my will to the decision of the person who has the authority. And I can't just say, well, I could do it better. And that's the whole idea, put aside the Pope, of nature of authority. So even your boss at work, to be honest, a Catholic disposition, if you're submitted to your boss, obviously in a different way than the Pope, but you're submitted. If the boss says, well, I want to do it this way, what that means is if you're to be obedient is you say, you know what, I think I could actually do it a better way. I have a more efficient, I'm not going to do that. You just say, okay, it was his call. It's within the scope of his authority. He's saying we're going to do this at work. It may not be the best decision, but that's what it means to submit to. Now, that's the way we should be towards the Pope's governance of the church, but the church has always put limits on that, right? That submission, when you just say, look, I think it could do this better, or this is not very prudent, or it's maybe not the best way, you do submit it because they have the authority. But the limits are, and this is really St. Thomas, first part of the second part, question 96, is if it exceeds the authority of the person giving it. So again, I'll start with this simple example. Your boss at work says, well, I've made a decision. You should go home and beat your wife. Well, first of all, aside from that being wrong, there's nothing to do with your authority. Like you can't, that's not within the scope of where I'm obedient to you. So you don't have to follow that. Now, for the Pope, since he has the supreme authority, it's a very different example. I agree, because his authority is much greater than my boss. But secondly, if the authority orders something, uses the authority to go contrary to the common good, so to order something which is against the natural or divine law, it endangers your soul. Now, let's go again with this simple example. So you're in the army, and your commanding officer tells you to murder innocent civilians. Right? They do have proper authority. They have a great scope of authority over you. But if they are ordering you directly to contravene divine and natural law, then you are still submitted to them. You're still my commanding officer. If you issue an order within that scope that's not contrary to divine and natural law, I will obey it. But I'm not obeying this order. Now, St. Thomas gives the example if an authority orders you to worship a false god. You don't do it. Now, the last case that he gives is interesting, and it gets into the difficult areas. So what if they order you to do something that is, it is not directly against the divine and natural law, but it is unjust? Then St. Thomas says you're not bound to follow it, but sometimes you might accept it when it doesn't cause you to do anything wrong, to contravene the divine or natural law. But for the other good reasons of prudence, you might go along with it. One, just maybe not to reduce respect for the authority. One, and he doesn't use this example, but one example might be an unjust tax that is not so unjust that it makes you unable to support your family, but it's just more than you should be paying. You're not obligated to pay it, but you might pay it to avoid other circumstances. And again, when we translate that to the Pope, I think there's several things we do have to be submitted. If there is something that he maybe orders that's just seems like a bad decision, but it's not contrary to divine and natural law, and it is not a danger to our faith. Because again, what is the common good that the Pope is entrusted with? The salvation of souls. So if he is giving a command that is against a danger to our souls, and I would argue, for example, go to the new Mass only. That's all. It's a danger to the faith, as Archbishop Lefebvre said. Then you just say, no, that is exceeding what you can do. And I think that the submission to the Roman Pontiff has to be understood in that broader, what the Church has taught about authority. And I will concede, we could go find quotes from a lot of saints that won't draw those distinctions. They won't say, oh, but if, because they were thinking of and dealing with a Pope that didn't do those things. And they therefore just gave the more simple, as Louis said, for simple Catholics, the simple rule, the rule of thumb that generally works is just, if the Pope says it, even if it's outside, even if it's not perfect, you're probably not going to get in trouble following it. And I do think one of the causes, and I'll end with this, that is contributing to our crisis today is the Church was blessed with a lot of good popes in a row. I mean, we went through from the late 19th into the early 20th century, some very holy, very good popes who, to be honest, they were always using the gifts and were more or less, Pope Pius X said do something, it's pretty unlikely it was going to be a bad decision. And so it was very easy for my great-grandparents' generation. They didn't have to say, well, wait, but the Church has said in extraordinary times when popes are refusing these supernatural gifts and are doing things on their own authority, not Christ's authority, you have to look at them and say, should I conform to this or not? But if they were living in our time again, my opinion would be, they would say, oh, well, obviously I meant that. I just didn't state those qualifications that others have just because it wasn't really necessary. So that was a lot, but that is sort of my perspective on that.
If I could offer a small follow-up on that, I know we're kind of stuck on the one question a little longer than we anticipated, but the examples you gave are good ones about the abuse of authority and ordering someone to do something that's a violation of the divine law or an unjust thing. We're not really talking about the moral order specifically in that manner when we're talking about the Pope as the father, teacher, and guide of the faithful in the matters of doctrine. And it's well within the Pope's authority to explain and to confirm it. And the simple faithful have always been encouraged by the Church. And actually the hierarchy of the Church, all of the bishops of the Church have been repeatedly throughout the ages encouraged, and they've been told that they're duty bound to follow the Roman Pontiff in the manner in which he explains and confirms the faith. So I think a distinction needs to be made that it's not a matter of the Pope exceeding his authority when he teaches falsehoods. No, that's an example of a man who stepped outside of membership in the Church, in a sense, in my opinion. It's not the same as him ordering you to do something immoral. It's a matter of him not explaining the faith accurately, and yet we're duty bound to follow him. Nowhere have I been able to find, and if maybe one of our listeners or you, Brian, or you, Father, can supply me with this, I would love to see something from a pope, a council, a doctor of the Church, a saint, a venerable theologian, even hinting that the faithful on occasion are called to discern whether the Pope is explaining the faith correctly, or is he possibly dispensing poisonous errors to us that might endanger our soul. I've never seen anything along those lines, but I've seen many things telling us that we should follow the Holy Father as our father, teacher, and guide. And we're living in an age where people have gotten comfortable with the fact that the norm is to look at everything that comes from the Holy Father, everything that comes from the Apostolic See, what I would call the conciliar church, a counterfeit, and run it through a sieve to see if there's any poison there, because there probably is. But that's not the way Catholics have ever behaved. And I don't think we live in we do live in a very unique age with regard to this crisis, but I don't think the uniqueness of it is that all of a sudden the Holy Roman Pontiffs are dispensing poison just as often as they're dispensing something nourishing for the soul. I don't think that's where we've come. And if that was even possible, I cannot believe that the church in her wisdom never thought to warn the faithful that there might come a time when the Holy Roman Pontiff is issuing teachings to the universal church that just might lead you to hell. But that's what's happening today.
I don't know, Father, do you want to respond?
Well, no, we're touching upon something that's very, important here is, to what extent then can the church be trusted when she is teaching authoritatively, but stopping short of issuing infallible definitions? You both have talked about extraordinary magisterium, ordinary magisterium, and as Louie has just pointed out, of late we are, the Vatican. It's very sad to say it, but it's not. It's no longer a lighthouse. It's gone very dark. When we've gotten to the point where we cannot trust anything that comes out of the Vatican today. I mean, we've come to that point. That's not normal in the church. Before we could trust, this document be better written, less better written, more eloquent, less eloquent. But, we always had Rome. But now Rome is grown dark, unfortunately. But is it Catholic Rome? Is it a modernist Rome? They're different. So to what extent then can the church be trusted? That's a question that, we should ask ourselves.
So, I'm sorry. Did you want to respond to that?
No. Go right ahead.
So again, I first do want to thank you, because I did say that I switched to the practical knowledge, the governance side, or the teaching on morals, and was explaining it there. So you are right. I didn't directly address what you brought up about the Pope as teacher in the office of teacher. And there again, I think the principles are the same, but they do obviously apply differently when now we're in the realm of speculative knowledge, not practical, but what do I need to believe? What do I need to know? And how do I know that that's something the church and God has really revealed to the church? And I think I don't think the church has ever taught that any pope who speaks in any context or who says anything about the faith or who teaches is always going to teach us free from error. I think the quotations you've quoted and others you've alluded to are essentially, again, in that general listening to the Pope, you're going to get more or less the truth. You're going to get a good guide, as you said it. But I don't think the church has ever declared that, that means that every time the Pope says something, it's always correct. And it's always a guide and always going to give you the truth. And again, there are examples in the history of the church, I'm sure we're all familiar of them, where John the 22nd is one, where he taught in sermons. He's teaching. That is, a sermon is exercising a teaching. We have the case again of Liberius, who again appeared to teach some things that were possibly Arian. There are examples. But what I think is the difference, because Louie, I think you're right. You're like, and I will concede, none of those examples are the scale of what we see with Francis. I would even say Paul VI. I would even say, not just Francis, nothing on that scale. I agree with you. But here's what I think is unique about our time. And it's what we also have to be careful with about the history. That in the history of the church, we do know a lot of the history. The church has kept good records. But we and those living in the times didn't have an interaction with the papacy the way we do, right? Because of modern media, modern mass communication. So we don't, first of all, somebody living in, let's say, the 11th century didn't really hear a lot of what the Pope said. He got certain documents, certain things, wasn't aware of them. And in terms of the historical memory of the church, in terms of examples, we don't have the record that we have with John Paul II, Francis, whose literally every word is written, is recorded almost everywhere. And so that is an important difference, because we are aware in a way that never in the history of the church of what the Pope is saying, even when teaching at different levels of authority, that nobody else ever was before, nor do we have records. So one problem we have is we can't just sort of say, well, here is a bad Pope, let's say Alexander VI, an immoral Pope. And a lot of people say, yeah, he was immoral, but he didn't say a lot of things that were bad. And that's true. We don't have a record of him denying a dogma of the faith or calling it into question or being ambiguous. But we also don't have press conference records of, or airplane flights where he's talking in front of cameras. And so that's just a difficulty in our ability to draw some historical conclusions when we are faced with a very different reality. And again, that causes a lot of practical problems for us. I'm not denying that, because it was a lot easier if there was a bad Pope, and a lot of those long lists of people who were immoral. Again, Alexander VI was a classic example. But when you're living, let's say, out in Ireland, what he was doing in Rome as a father, as a bad father, is it affecting you the way it does in the modern world? And that's part of our crisis. Every word that comes out of Francis's mouth, you can find everywhere. And the impact of those non-infallible, extraordinary, is omnipresent. And that makes this very, very difficult. And I'll just wrap up the last reaction, because you've said it a couple of times now about Father, our Father, and how I think the Pope is our Father, but also, and he's a father with gifts, but like our natural father, because he is a human being, he's not Christ, he can get sick. And I think that we have to recognize that, if our father gets dementia, our human father, or Alzheimer's, and he starts saying things, and again, this is an analogy, I will concede, but he is still our father, right? He's still our father, but we say, you know what, Dad, we're not going to do what you're saying to do. We're not going to give you this poison because you're saying it, because you are sick right now. And again, my best way, and I concede it's in eternity, or if we live through this and the church comes back to the way she went to normal, she'll explain this to us. But my best way of coping with it now is that some of these people, if they're popes, are fathers, but they're sick, and they're sick fathers. And we are being called on to distinguish, in the way you say, sort through, not on the basis of our own judgment, but on what we know from 2,000 years of the history of the church, what is certain, and sift through it and say, well, they're sick. We can't follow this teaching. We know that this is wrong because we have this history of the church, just like you would with your natural father. You'd say, okay, we know what he's saying now is coming from his disease, not coming from him. And interestingly, that's why I think this crisis in the church can only happen now. It couldn't have happened in the first or second century, because we have that benefit. To use the analogy, we stand on the shoulders of giants. We have 2,000 years of the ordinary and extraordinary magisterium, so that we know with greater precision what God has revealed, because we have those 2,000 years of the church teaching, so that we are better equipped for this unique crisis. I mean, it's almost, I know a priest once said to me, I said, I wish I wasn't born in this time. Why couldn't I be born in the Middle Ages when, we didn't have to face this? And he said, God causes each one of us to be born in the time that he wants us to be born, that's best for the salvation of our soul, and in a time when what we will need will be given to us, wouldn't be given to somebody else in a different time because they didn't need it. And that's the way I think about that we are being called, the faithful Catholics do have to sift the words of, whether it's Paul VI, John Paul II, even Benedict XVI, I'd even say, Francis, but it's not sifting. I would be really careful with our own personal judgment. That is Protestantism. And I think we are falsely accused, you're just Protestant. We are not sifting with our own judgment, but we have the ability to go back and say, this is what the church has always and everywhere taught. That is the sifter, not our own judgment. So
the difficulty I would have with that analysis is that, again, it leaves the simple Catholic, which is the majority of humanity, I believe, maybe not, but it's a large segment of humanity, a large segment of the members of the church who are simple. And even though if we couch it in terms of saying it's not according to your own judgment, but it's according to what the church has always taught, it puts the onus on this simple person to the point where they can't follow the Lord's command to be as little children. They can't. And if it was ever possible for a legitimate pope, a true vicar of Christ, to get so sick that he could authoritatively dispense poisonous errors that would endanger the soul, such that we have to sift through them to make sure that we don't consume that poison, I have to believe that Holy Mother Church at some point over the past nearly 2,000 years would have articulated that possibility and said, there might come a day when a true vicar of Christ might dispense poison to you in the name of the church and present it to you as good food, similar to the way in which Satan pointed to the apple in the garden and convinced Eve that it was good for food. So be on your guard. But we see nothing like that. It's not even hinted at all in 2,000 years. And so I would have a little trouble with that, because ultimately it puts the burden on the individual simple person to determine, even if he's using the magisterium over 2,000 years as the measuring stick, he's acting as his own rule of faith then. Rule meaning measure. So it's up to me now to act as the rule of faith and to measure what's coming from the Pope against what the church has always taught. But that's not the Catholic Church. It's never been the Catholic Church. And it's never been hinted that there could come a day when that could be the church. And so that comes us right back to the question that Father asked: to what extent can the church be trusted when she's teaching authoritatively on faith and morals? And this idea of teaching authoritatively, Brian, I appreciate very much what you said about, it certainly doesn't mean that every word that comes out of the Pope's mouth, and we're inundated with them. We have been since Francis walked out on that balcony. It's unbelievable. The guy's a fire hose.
Yes.
But there are going to be cases, and you mentioned John the 22nd. I would imagine if someone was standing there listening to that sermon that he gave, where he spoke an error about, to be fair to him, a theological question that had not been settled and was still up for debate about the beatific vision of the blessed in heaven. He said that it doesn't happen until the general resurrection. Ends up he was wrong. If you were standing there that day listening to the sermon, you might not be clear about whether this is just the Pope as a person giving his opinion, or whether it's the church teaching me something authoritatively. But that's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with the documents of what's said to be a valid ecumenical council of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. That's not comparable to a magazine interview of Jorge Bergoglio. We can see very clearly that's what is being presented to us as an exercise of the supreme magisterium of the church. And I would say that those things can, if they really are coming from the Catholic Church, they absolutely can be trusted. And we have, I could string off a dozen examples of how this has been the ecclesiology of the church as taught throughout many centuries has made this point, that the church cannot err in teaching and faith and morals. Going back to the Roman Catechism, it says the church can't err in faith and morals because it has the Holy Ghost as its guide. One of the quotes that I jotted down for this conversation, which is one that I really like a lot, Pius XI, writing in Quas Primas in 1925 on the Feast of Christ the King, he mentions almost matter-of-factly, because it's already understood after centuries of ecclesiology, that the church can't err in faith and morals. And he says, again, almost matter-of-factly, the church is endowed with perfect and perpetual immunity from error and heresy. And I love this quote because he points to both error and heresy. He's not saying it's just immune from heresy properly so called, but error. His predecessor, Pius XII, Jesus Christ hanging on the cross opened up to his church the fountain of those divine gifts which prevent her from ever teaching false doctrine. He says elsewhere in the same document, certainly the loving mother of the church is spotless in the faith, which she has always preserved inviolate. And there's many more quotes of that nature that I could share with you and with our viewers. And one of the things that we'll notice when we see all of these repeated commentaries about how the church cannot err in faith and morals, it's never qualified with, but only when she's issuing dogmatic definitions. Otherwise, she might just be handing you poison, so be on your toes. We don't see anything like that in nearly 2,000 years. And so that tells me that this institution and these men that are dispensing teachings that need to be sifted through for poison, it's not the church speaking. It's an imposter.
Well, if I could just respond to that, I think in two ways. One, I think we do have to distinguish between, when we say all those statements say the church, right? So the church, the Pope and the church are not synonymous. So to pick an example, I'm sure we'll appreciate, the Church of Christ is the Catholic Church. They are synonymous. Those two terms mean exactly the same thing. The Pope and the church are related very deeply, but are not the same thing. And again, I'll start with a simple example to prove that. Every action of, and I'll pick, to stay away from Pope Francis just to make the point so it's clear, let's take Pius XII. Every action or statement or word of Pope Pius XII, even after he's elected, is not the church necessarily. We have to distinguish between actions or statements of Pope Pius XII and when he is acting as the church. And again, I think there's definitely a distinction because, again, a real simple one. When Pope Pius XII says, let's just say, I'll make up a story. If he ever said, beef is better than chicken. Well, that is not the church speaking. That is Pope Pius XII. And again, I know you wouldn't disagree with that. But that's a sort of simple example to show that it is possible that the man who holds the office doesn't lose his individual capacity. He still can act as a man separate, not in the sense that he's not in the church, but as a separate being acting when the church isn't acting. Now, from that example, I know what you'll say. Obviously, when he's preaching, when he's teaching, that's different from making some silly statement like my example. But again, here is where I think the church has not yet clarified, right? That when is it, we know that not every statement, not every sermon, not every even teaching moment. If the Pope is teaching a catechism class to little children, he is teaching as a man, but is that actually the church teaching catechism then, or giving that sermon? Again, I don't think it always is. Sometimes he is acting as the church. Sometimes he is not. We know he's acting as the church when he gives an infallible definition ex cathedra. But where that line is not something the church has not yet defined. I don't think there's anything in the church that denies that distinction exists, but the church has not yet given us that point of clarification. Again, I think this crisis, that's something that will have to come out of it, giving us that further definition. But I think in principle, we cannot, those quotes that all of them say the church cannot teach her, and I think that's true, but that's premised on the fact that when Francis says something like all religions are willed by God, that is not the church speaking. That is Francis speaking and is not the church. Now, I can't give you the exact definition yet of when we draw that distinction, but I think it's there. And then the last point I will, because you asked for an example. I do agree with you. Most of the history of the church, it hasn't been this crisis, so those warnings aren't given, but there are little elements of them. I'll just give one from Gratian's Decretum, and I don't have it right in front of me, so I'm going to do this from memory, but it is in the Decretum. I referred to it earlier. He says, and I am paraphrasing because I don't have it in front of me, no one can judge the Holy See, right? No one judges the Pope, except in the case of heresy. So there is, even in that statement, an admission, like here's the normal rule, but there is a foreseen a possibility of a Pope falling into heresy as a possibility. Now, there's a lot of then disagreement about what you do about it and who and how. That's never been resolved because we can't find a clear historical example where a pope was deposed by an organ of the church for heresy, but that possibility that there could be a pope falling into heresy has been put out there, and I think that warning is sort of the example I think you're looking for. It's not the normal thing, but it could happen. And what then the organs of the church do about it, I think there's a lot of speculation about. So that's a lot.
If I could respond, I mean, I appreciate the examples you're given of, where there may not be clarity as to whether it's the church that's speaking or the man, the Pope teaching children catechism and things of that nature. But that's not what we're talking about. I think as a matter of practical knowledge, I don't think there's any room for debate that the Second Vatican Council, if it really and truly was a valid ecumenical council of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, where an overwhelming majority of the world's bishops assembled to teach doctrine on faith and morals, albeit without invoking the charism of infallibility, approved and promulgated to the universal church by the man claiming to be Pope, that's a teaching action of the church. I don't think anyone in their right mind would point to that and say, but that was just the human element behaving badly. No, clearly, that was an action of the church. I think as a matter of practical knowledge, we can say the same about an apostolic exhortation that comes from the man claiming to be Pope that's addressed. I'm going to read the title. Apostolic exhortation of the Holy Father to the bishops, priests, and deacons, consecrated persons, and all the lay faithful. And this document's disseminated throughout the universal church. Church synods are set up to figure out how to apply it. Clearly, this is intended to be an action of the church, and this is Amoris Laetitia. And none of the three of us think that this is something that we can pick up as an action of the church because it's littered with error. So I don't think the crisis that we're dealing with really is this massive gray area between what is the church acting. If this thing in Rome today, this conciliar church, is the Catholic Church, it has made abundantly clear through the voice of the men claiming to be the Pope that these are to be received by the faithful as actions of the church. And if the reigning Pope cannot tell us in real time what is an action of the church and what isn't, I mean, really, how on earth can a simple man ever navigate his way through this world and stay on the path to salvation? He can't. And I would argue that's not the church that our Lord gave us. He gave us one that would enable us to be as little children and to be able to conform our faith to the faith that's explained and confirmed by the Holy Roman Pontiff, his vicar. And so I don't think there's nearly as much gray area to be had as perhaps, your characterization implies, even though it's there in many cases. But I don't think it's definitely not gray when it comes to the council. Clearly, that's being presented to the world as an action of the Supreme Magisterium, the church.